And Robin says, I have a stronger posterior chain than anterior chain. I've been really disciplined in my deadlifts to make sure I'm switching on my posterior chain. What other movements would be good to be aware of this difference? And how do I make sure I'm not being lazy or posterior chain aggressive or dominant? So a couple of points here and a couple of things that we can unpack. So the issue here is that Robin is very strong through her posterior chain and is therefore overutilizing this with movements that may be more anterior chain dominant. For example, her deadlift may be very good, her back squat may be good, but then when you look at transferring that to a more Olympic lifting style high bar back squat, front squat, or through cleans, there may be some sort of issue starting to emerge with some technique faults. So firstly, we need to look at exercise selection. So if you need to improve a certain muscle group, it goes without saying that you should be doing exercises which are predisposed to working that muscle group. So we may include more anterior chain dominant work in Robin's training. However, this on its own is not enough because our body is very good at finding easy or efficient ways to do something. It finds the path of least resistance. And to do this, it will try and recruit that stronger posterior chain, those stronger muscles through the back of the body, and try and use these instead of using the anterior chain, these muscles in the front of the body, to do a certain movement. Now, although in the short term this can be an effective strategy, where maybe you turn a squat into more of a good morning type movement, where your hips lift first, therefore putting the posterior chain under a little bit more tension, like I said, turning it into a good morning or like a deadlift type hip hinge movement, rather than the extension of the knee. So in the short term, this can be an effective strategy because it may make you lift more weight. However, you're only lifting more weight because you've underdeveloped a certain muscle group, which you're now trying to avoid. So short-term benefit here, but in the long run, there's a much lower ceiling, a much lower potential that you have on this movement. So although it may make you lift more when you're testing your max this week, it will not make you lift more when you're testing your max in 6, 12, 24 months time. So we're looking to maybe take a step backwards or a step to the side, fixing some of these underlying issues, some of these underlying imbalances, and then we can accelerate in the long run, we can raise that ceiling and be able to lift more. So the first thing we have to look at to do this, and this is something that Robin did mention in her question, and this is the concept of real disciplined movement. You have to be disciplined to not take that path of least resistance. And this applies to any change you're trying to make in your life, not just a change to a movement pattern, but if you look at habits that you're trying to generate. It's not always easy to introduce a new habit, a new behavior, or in this case, a new movement pattern. There may be a little bit of resistance early on. You have to have the discipline to stick with that behavior change until that behavior change becomes a habit. Exactly the same with movement patterns. So have the discipline to say, I'm not going to let my body move forward. I'm not going to let this turn into a good morning, a glorified hip hinge type movement. I'm going to keep my discipline, hold my good body position. Even though I know this is not the easiest way today for me to do this, by doing this, it will become the easiest way in the long run. Because what you'll be doing by being disciplined with your movement is using the correct movement and muscle recruitment patterns, which will allow you to then strengthen them. And then the weakest link in your chain no longer becomes the weakest link in the chain, and this ceiling is increased. Now, of course, as soon as there's a requirement for discipline, there's also the option that you're going to drop the ball. So again, if we're trying to introduce a new movement pattern, when things start to get tough, as you're fatigued, or maybe as you're approaching your 1 rep max, your body will go back to its old incorrect movement patterns and habits. So sometimes discipline is not enough. Sometimes it's not enough to say, I'm going to stick with this movement pattern, because again, your body finds the easiest way to do things. So sometimes you can actually put physical barriers in place so it completely removes that need for discipline. Something like some squat therapy, where you're doing an air squat facing the wall, trying to get as close to that wall as you can with your arms extended overhead. You don't have the option then of rounding through your lumbar spine, of hinging excessively at the hip, of letting your thoracic spine start to go into flexion. You don't have that option because there's a wall there stopping you. So you don't need to be disciplined because the wall is playing that role for you. Maybe if you're doing a front squat and you're trying to train this movement in a front squat and you're trying to be a little more upright, again, to be a bit more anterior chain dominant, you can be doing your front squats close to a rack. So as you unrack that bar, instead of stepping back a meter or so, stay close. So you don't get the option to round forward, because if you do, the bar will hit the rack and you'll get some instant feedback that you have an incorrect movement pattern there. It may mean you have to drop down the weight, but long run, there will be a net gain. The final piece of advice I would offer here, this is when you're trying to change any movement pattern, is judge the completion of your reps, not purely on their completion and a start point, a midpoint, and an end point, but also on the quality as well. Now, this is easy to do if you're working one-on-one with a coach, because the coach can put certain quality criteria in place where they will say, for this front squat to count, the following 3 criteria must be met. Now take note, these criteria aren't standing with full extension at the top, hip crease passing below knee at the bottom, and then coming back to full extension at the top, but instead they are the little intricacies of what happened in between these points. So if the elbows drop past a certain point, it would constitute a no rep. If the knees are falling in, it constitutes a no rep. So judge the quality of the repetitions based on quality, not just completion.